Have you ever played the game Would You Rather? It is a game where two scenarios are presented to you and you have to choose one of them. So I'm a grandmother who gets to spend most of my days with my two-year-old grandchildren. Yes, two of them. And yes, they are only 8 days apart. And they are quite invested in that stage of their life where they no longer feel they need me to help them make decisions. Because after all, they are two and they know what they want without my help. So most lunch times at my house look a little bit like this. Andrew and Bailey, would you rather have a sandwich or mac and cheese for lunch? Cookies. That is not an option. Although they know full well there are cookies in the house, so this must be an option. No, Grandma said a sandwich or mac and cheese are your choices. Wurgurt, which is their version of yogurt. And again, they were just perusing the insides of our refrigerator and they know that there is yogurt. This can sometimes last quite a long time, and I'm going to leave it up to your imagination as to whether I win or they do. In the game, Would You Rather, the topics can be a little bit more important, intense, ridiculous, and sometimes unfathomable. Would you rather be the funniest person in the room or the most intelligent? Would you rather only eat your favorite food, popcorn, for the rest of your life, or never eat it again? Would you rather always be too hot or too cold? Would you rather be trapped in a room full of mosquitoes or rats? Would you rather be surrounded by people in your same political party and get no vote, or people of your opposing party and get a vote? I know that when I have played this game with my kids in the past, my answer was almost always neither, which is not an option. These scenarios are mostly so far-fetched that no person would ever have to choose between them. And it is just supposed to be a funnish game that forces us to choose between two equally ridiculous or amazing scenarios without any other options. No gray area. But let's be real. How often is there truly only two options? When are things just black and white, this or that, one or the other? Well, except maybe this. It's coming. It's worth it. It's worth the wait. I mean, right? Can't we just all agree that bacon's amazing and there's really no other option? In our Lenten series, we have been using the Brené Brown book, Braving the Wilderness, as a guide for our journey to Easter. We have explored the idea of true belonging, being alone in the wilderness, finding our own truth, leaning in with each other, and this week we are exploring the idea of speaking truth to BS. I didn't get to say the real word. They wouldn't let me. And being civil. The chapter starts with a quote from Harry Frankfurt. Someone who lies and someone who tells the truth are playing on opposite sides, so to speak, in the same game. Each responds to the facts as he understands them, although the response of the one is guided by the authority of the truth, while the response of the other defies that authority and refuses to meet its demands. The BSer ignores these demands altogether. He does not reject the authority of the truth, as the liar does, and oppose himself to it. He pays no attention to it at all. By virtue of this, BS is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. So I don't know about you, but for me and many people I have spoken with, our world feels more volatile, divisive, and oftentimes more separated than any recent time we can recall. Racist and misogynistic rhetoric has come out of the dark corners, and the shadows of hate speech and mutual distrust are everywhere. It sometimes feels like we are in a worldwide game of would you rather. Would you rather think like me or be wrong. I love the visual that Brené uses in her book about being holed up in our bunkers. Bunkers that are only filled with and next to others who think, feel, and do the same as we do, sheltered away from any opposing opinions, ideologies, and beliefs. A place that can sometimes act as a refuge from the harshness of the world, but that can also create an echoing of only our own thoughts and beliefs, without any room for compromise, shared growth, or collaboration. Harry Frankfurt, an American philosopher whose quote I just read, wrote a book called On BS. He explores the reasons and intricacies of how and why we use BS as a tool for navigating situations and circumstances where we have little to no knowledge or feel compromised on the facts of certain topics. Or, and even more dangerously, when our only goal is to align others with us, or to draw a firm line in the sand that says, if you are on the opposite side of me, you are wrong. It is through this practice of BS that we have created the false dichotomy of a you are either with me or against me culture. This can be an extremely slippery slope and compound dissension. We retreat to our corners, fists raised, mouth guards in, ready to come out swinging when the bell rings. We are so connected to what we feel to be the truth that we cannot see any other way than to arduously work in an attempt to bring others to our side. Often, we have used this with us or against us notion to inspire action, to form together a faction of we will not stand for this people. After 9/11, both Hillary Clinton and President Bush declared to the world, you are either with us in the fight against terrorism or you are our enemy. In that time of fear and deep sadness, it was easy to choose a side. Of course, we do not support or align ourselves with anyone who could perpetrate such violence towards humankind. We hung flags on our front porches, even on our vehicles. We came together and held hands at vigil services and found deep connection with strangers through our shared experience. It was good in the midst of uncertain and frightening times, and it seemed like picking a side meant that we were together, that we were committed to the same things, and that we could face the issues that confronted us with shared vision. However, what we found after the intensity of that time started to settle was that we did not and could not always agree on what being united together as an us meant as far as the action we would take. In the beginning, it seemed okay for it to feel like a black and white choice, and that certainly we could and always would stand united on this issue. And how often do we find ourselves in this quandary, where it seemed as if a black and white, with me or against me, this or that choice was simple and easy to commit to? But the reality is, it is not easy or simple, and life is mostly painted with an infinite cascade of grays. We do not live in a world of black and white. We have a continuum of gray that surrounds us, and it is where we find the most valuable and important parts of life in humanity. This deeply complex matter is at the heart of this chapter. It is hard, challenging, and isolating sometimes to stand in the gray and to brave the wilderness by speaking truth to BS and holding true to the notion that there is almost always more than just two choices that we are often presented with, if not forced, to make a choice between. Our scripture reading today comes from John chapter 8, verses 4 through 7. The Pharisees come to Jesus and say, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. Moses says in the law that we are to kill such women by stoning. What do you say about it?" This was all set up as a test for Jesus. His answers would give them grounds to accuse him of crimes against Moses' law. Jesus bent over and wrote something in the dirt with his finger. But they persisted in badgering Jesus, so he stood up straight and said this, "Let the first stone be thrown by the one among you who has not sinned." The law was clear. The woman who was accused of adultery was to be stoned for her sins, and the Pharisees knew this. They didn't need to ask Jesus for clarification, but they were trying to get him to choose a side. If he told them not to stone her, then he condemned the law of Moses and therefore could be accused of crimes against the state. Or if he affirmed the law and said, yes, stone the woman, then that would prove that he wasn't the prophet, the outsider who challenged things and encouraged a new way of thinking, or the king, as he was supposedly said to be. Jesus did not step on one or other side of the hypothetical line drawn in the sand. Instead, he took a moment and then presented a response that could only be defined as being in the gray. He did not say, stone her, and he did not say, you cannot stone her. But he told them, you make your choice, but before you do, think about yourselves and whether your life is free of sin. And if you are free of sin, you be the first to throw the stone. If we were to read further into the text, we would learn that eventually all the Pharisees left and the woman and Jesus were left alone. The world and our lives are a great expanse of gray area, and living in the gray is not always an easy place to be. It is scary, and it can feel like standing alone in the wilderness for sure. However, the reward and grace that comes when we are willing to reject the notion that only two options exist, and that if you do not belong in my bunker, then you must certainly be my enemy, is worth it. I believe that we are all called to live in the gray, and I believe this is what Jesus teaches us through his own examples. As human beings, we not only have the capacity, but also a responsibility to be kind, to be free of hate, to treat others with dignity, to be true to ourselves, and to be open to the truth of others. We share more than we don't, and living in the gray allows us the freedom to engage in meaningful and collaborative lives with others. We most certainly must ignore the urge to be right and to be the loudest so our message is heard, or to participate in divisive arguments. We need to practice civility, claiming and caring for our own identities, needs, and beliefs without degrading or disregarding someone else's in the process. So how do we do this? How do we find ourselves at the heart of the gray? First and foremost, we need to step outside of our own bunkers, those places where we feel safe, sheltered, and embraced by all things that support our way of thinking and being. We need to stand in our own truth without hesitation or fear of rejection, humiliation, and judgment. And we must stand in the strong foundation that others are venturing from their own safe bunkers and are treading lightly in this place called wilderness as well. We need to have a generous spirit towards others, opting to believe that for the most part, our opinions and beliefs are not simply meant to contradict one another, to cause harm, or to engage in bullying-type tactics. They are just merely sewn from the thread of our own personal experiences, the ways in which we were raised, and/or the misunderstandings of how we believe things are. We must sit around tables and on couches if you were here last week and got to see our guest speaker, she showed us the couches that were at General Conference that were a safe place for people who had disagreements or wanted to really discuss things where they could go and do that. That was pretty cool. So we must sit on those couches in churches and at work and face one another and commit to listening and hearing each other. We must be willing to ask questions and to admit when we truly don't know the facts or even enough about an issue or situation to contribute quality opinions. We cannot fall into the rhythm offering a position based on what we know our people believe. We must quit drawing lines in the sand and fractioning people into predisposed groups based on who we think they are. And beyond all else, we most certainly must lead with our hearts. We should look at ourselves in the mirror and ask the tough questions. Who am I? What do I stand for? What prejudices do I place on others? And what walls have I built to shelter myself from other voices? I personally have very strong and deep convictions about things. I am a strong voice, and upon self-reflection from this wilderness journey that we've been on, I know that I have not only placed others into bunkers of my choosing, I have also forced myself into false dilemmas of making me think there are only two ways of discernment on a subject. I have not always offered a generous spirit for others that have opposing views than I. And I have an impulsive, jump in with both feet, let's do this thing kind of personality, which upon deeper contemplation has quite possibly not given room for maneuvering within the gray area. Tyler Amundsen, who most of you know, is also preaching on the same series at Shiloh in Billings, and he shared a story with me that he is using in his sermon, and I told him I was going to borrow it. A story is told of an incident that happened during the 30s in New York City on one of the coldest days of the year. The world was in the grip of the Great Depression, and all over the city, the poor were close to starvation. It happened that a judge was sitting on the bench that day, hearing a complaint against a woman who was charged with stealing a loaf of bread. She pleaded that her daughter was sick and her grandchildren were starving because their father had abandoned the family. But the shopkeeper whose loaf had been stolen refused to drop the charge. He insisted that an example be made of the poor old woman as a deterrent to others. The judge sighed. He was reluctant to pass judgment on the woman, yet he had no alternative. "I am sorry," he turned to her, "but I can't make any exceptions. The law is the law. I sentence you to a fine of $10, and if you cannot pay it, I must send you to jail for 10 days. The woman was heartbroken. But even as he was passing sentence, the judge was reaching into his pocket for the money to pay off the $10 fine. He took off his hat, tossed the $10 bill into it, and then addressed the crowd. "I am also going to impose a fine of 50 cents on every person here present in this courtroom for living in a town where a person has to steal bread to save her grandchildren from starvation. Please collect the fines, Mr. Bailiff, in this hat and pass them across to the defendant." And so the accused went home that day from the courtroom with $47.50, 50 cents of which had been paid by the shamefaced grocery store keeper who had brought the charge against her. And as she left the courtroom, the gathering of petty criminals and New York City policemen gave the judge a standing ovation. This is a perfect example of black, white, and gray. It is wrong to steal, and the law is the law. And it is set up to keep order in what would otherwise be a crazy and hectic society if we were all left to decide on ourselves what was right and what was wrong. By definition, the woman was a criminal. She had broken the law that states we are not permitted to take from another without compensation. The shopkeeper lost money because of what she did and felt that he was entitled to justice. In weighing the facts of the situation, the judge could not deny that she had crossed that line in the sand that represented the right and wrong of this circumstance. However, the judge also decided to take a journey into the gray when making his decision. He felt he had no choice but to administer a punishment fitting the crime she had perpetrated, but knew that there were extenuating circumstances that led this woman to steal. She was not a criminal by nature. She did not steal for the fun of getting away with it, and she was at a crossroads in her life where her choices were limited and equally horrific. She was in a real-life scenario of would you rather? Would you rather break the law and possibly pay the consequences to save your family, or watch your family perish knowing you could have saved them? This is tough. And I know people who stand firmly on both sides of this argument. People who, no matter what side they fall on, are good, generous, kind human beings. Many years ago, a friend of mine was leading a discussion for a group that had been struggling to find shared connection within the midst of disagreement. She placed a cardboard box in the middle of the center of a circle. In the middle of the center? That's very specific. On the top of the box was a big red heart, which everyone could see. On each side of the box was a different letter written in different colors. As we sat in the circle, she asked us what we could see. From one vantage point, the person could see a big blue letter A and part of a green D. Another person could only see an orange C. Still another could see a purple B and just the edges of the blue-colored A, but not even enough to make out that it was an actual letter. After several people had shared, she then asked people who sat across from those who shared, "Can you see what they see?" The answer, of course, was no. She then asked, "Do you believe that they can see it?" And almost unanimously, everyone said yes. There was nothing to lead the group to disbelieve the others sitting around the circle and what they described about their view of the box. All of us could see a big red heart. Although we never talked about it in these terms, that was an exercise of living in the gray. I knew for sure what I could see, and no one could talk me out of it. And I felt wholeheartedly that what the others could see was real and true to them, even if I could not see it myself. And most importantly, we could all agree that there was a big red heart on top of the box, visible to all of us, no matter what vantage point we came from. Living in the gray is challenging. It is hard. It is scary, but it is imperative. Imperative to living a life where we can all feel safe to roam around the gray, to wander into each other's bunkers without fear of retribution, and to standing strong in our own truth. We must brave the wilderness and speak truth to BS while remaining civil and generous. We must recognize that the boundless shades of gray, and yes, there are more than 50, create space for all of us to be true to who we are and to offer open and welcoming interactions with all who we encounter in this world. I will leave you with this verse from 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 13 through 14. This is the Message translation. Keep your eyes open. Hold tight to your convictions. Give it all you've got. Be resolute and love without stopping. Amen.